The Kentucky Bloodbath of 1979. The Adkins family slaughtered 19 men who stole their prize horses. The bloodiest act of vengeance in Kentucky mountain history and the most devastating campaign of retribution the Cumberland Highlands had ever witnessed from a family whose horses were their legacy, their livelihood, and their very souls. This is the true story of the Adkins family. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Pike County, Kentucky, in the shadow of the Cumberland Plateau, known throughout the region as one of the most isolated and fiercely independent corners of the state. The mountains rise here in ancient folds of sandstone and coal, their hollows sheltering families who had carved lives from wilderness and who had defended those lives against all who threatened them. The people who settled these mountains came seeking freedom from interference, and their descendants maintained that spirit through generations of conflict with outsiders, who never understood that these hills had their own laws, their own justice, their own ways of handling matters that no one from the flatlands had any business involving themselves in. You see, in Pike County during the years of our story, horse people were a breed apart. The families who bred and raised horses in the Kentucky mountains occupied a position of respect that transcended wealth or social standing. Their animals were not merely livestock, but living testaments to generations of knowledge, each horse the product of careful breeding decisions that stretched back a century or more, each foal carrying in its blood the accumulated wisdom of grandfathers and great-grandfathers who had understood the marriage of bloodline and mountain terrain in ways that no textbook could teach. The connection between a horse family and their animals was not something outsiders could easily comprehend. These were not pets and not simply working animals. They were partners in the truest sense of the word, living, breathing extensions of the family itself, carrying in their hooves and their hearts the same independence and spirit that defined the mountain people who bred them. To steal a man's horse in the Kentucky mountains was not mere theft. It was an act of violation that struck at the very heart of who that man was and what his family had spent generations building. The family who would become known throughout Kentucky simply as the Adkins had lived in the hollows of Pike County for 6 generations. Since Josiah Adkins had brought his first pair of horses across the mountains from Virginia in the years following the American Revolution, Josiah had recognized something in the Kentucky mountain terrain that was perfectly suited to the kind of horse he wanted to breed, animals that combined the endurance of working stock with the beauty and spirit of finer bloodlines. He had spent the rest of his life perfecting his program, and his sons had continued after him, and their sons after them, until the Adkins name had become synonymous with the finest mountain horses in eastern Kentucky. That's right. The Adkins horse program was not a hobby or a sideline, but a legacy that had been built over nearly 200 years of careful work. Each generation had added to the knowledge that the previous generation had accumulated, had refined the breeding decisions that produced animals of extraordinary quality. The horses that carried the Adkins brand were recognized throughout the region as the finest of their kind, animals whose combination of beauty and toughness and intelligence reflected the mountains themselves. By the time of the events of our story in 1979, the family patriarch was a man named Elijah Adkins, 64 years old, the 6th generation of his family to breed horses on the same land that Josiah had claimed nearly 2 centuries earlier. Elijah was a tall man, lean and weathered by decades of outdoor labor, his face carved by sun and wind into an expression of permanent watchfulness. He had been working with horses since before he could walk, had absorbed the family's accumulated knowledge through years of apprenticeship under his own father, had dedicated his life to maintaining and improving the program that represented his family's greatest achievement. Elijah's wife, Della, had come from a horse family herself, the Comseys of neighboring Letcher County, whose own breeding program had produced animals that complemented the Adkins bloodlines perfectly. Their marriage had been arranged as much by the horses as by the families, Della's father recognizing in the Adkins program a home for his daughter that would also benefit his own stock. The match had proved ideal in every way, producing 5 children and strengthening the breeding program through the combination of 2 distinguished bloodlines. The 5 Adkins children, 4 sons and a daughter, had all inherited their parents' passion for horses. The eldest son, Thomas, was 38 at the time of our story, already an accomplished horseman in his own right, responsible for much of the day-to-day management of the breeding program. His brothers Samuel, William, and James ranged in age from 35 to 28, each one playing a specific role in the family operation. The daughter, Mary, had married a man named Crawford from the next hollow, but remained deeply involved in the family's horsework, her knowledge of bloodlines and conformation rivaling her brother's. Together, the Adkins family managed a herd of 47 horses, ranging from proven broodmares whose foals were sought throughout the region to young colts and fillies still developing their potential. But the crown jewels of the program, the animals that represented the pinnacle of 6 generations of breeding knowledge, were 4 stallions whose quality was so extraordinary that horsemen traveled from distant states just to see them. These 4 stallions were the heart and soul of the Adkins operation, the living embodiment of everything the family had worked for over nearly 2 centuries. The first was Solomon, a 17-hand bay, whose conformation was so perfect that horsemen who saw him for the first time often stood in silence, unable to find words adequate to describe what they were seeing. Solomon was 12 years old, in the prime of his breeding career, his offspring already demonstrating the qualities that made him irreplaceable. His bloodline traced directly back to the original horses that Josiah Adkins had brought across the mountains. 6 generations of careful selection distilled into a single magnificent animal. His coat in sunlight was the color of dark honey, his mane and tail flowing black, his eyes carrying an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth. The second was Ezekiel, a 16-hand black whose power and intelligence had made him legendary throughout the Kentucky horse world. Ezekiel was 9 years old, younger than Solomon, but already producing foals that rivaled his sire's best offspring. He represented the infusion of Della's Combs bloodline into the Adkins program, the successful merger of 2 distinguished families through the medium of horseflesh and bone. His color was so uniformly black that he seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a darkness that was beautiful rather than menacing, the concentrated essence of everything the Combs family had bred for. The third was Prophet, a 15-hand sorrel whose speed and agility on mountain terrain was unmatched by any horse in the region. Prophet was 7 years old, the youngest of the 4 stallions, his potential still unfolding in ways that excited the family with each new foal he produced. He was the future of the program, the horse that would carry the Adkins bloodlines forward into the next generation and beyond. His copper coat blazed like fire in the afternoon sun, and his spirit was as wild and free as the mountain wind that blew through the hollows where he had been born. The fourth was Patriarch, the oldest of the stallions at 15, a grey whose wisdom and steadiness had made him the anchor of the entire breeding program. Patriarch's foals were known for their temperament as much as their physical qualities, producing horses that were both beautiful and reliable in ways that mountain life demanded. He was Elijah's personal favorite, the horse he had raised from a foal, the animal whose development he had supervised with the same care and attention he had given his own children. His color had lightened with age from dark iron to silver white, his mane flowing like mountain mist, his eyes carrying the calm authority of an animal who had never encountered a situation he could not master. These 4 stallions were worth more than any amount of money could measure, their value lying not merely in their individual qualities, but in what they represented, the irreplaceable genetic culmination of 6 generations of breeding knowledge. They could not be replaced because the specific combination of bloodlines, the particular sequence of breeding decisions that had produced them, could never be exactly reproduced. They were living history, each one a chapter in a story that had begun when Josiah Adkins first crossed the mountains with a dream of what Kentucky horses could become. Now, to understand what happened in the autumn of 1979, you need to understand the particular circumstances that had made the Adkins horses targets for the men who would steal them. A syndicate of wealthy buyers from outside the region had been acquiring horses throughout eastern Kentucky, using a combination of money and coercion to build collections that they could resell at enormous profit in the flatland markets. The syndicate was led by a man named Vernon Sloan, a horse trader from Lexington, whose legitimate business served as a front for operations that included theft, fraud, and intimidation. Sloan had identified the Adkins stallions as the most valuable horses in the region, had approached Elijah multiple times with offers to purchase some or all of them, had been refused each time with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. The stallions were not for sale. They would never be for sale. They were the family's heritage, their life's work, their connection to 6 generations of ancestors who had devoted their lives to building something that money could not buy. Sloan was not accustomed to being refused. He was a man who had built his fortune by taking what he wanted and using his connections to avoid consequences, a man whose wealth and political influence had made him effectively untouchable in the horse-trading world. Elijah's refusal to sell was not merely an inconvenience, but an affront, a challenge to the authority that Sloan believed his money entitled him to exercise. He assembled a team of 19 men, a combination of hired thieves and local collaborators who knew the mountain terrain well enough to navigate it at night. These men were experienced horse thieves who had stolen animals throughout the region, men whose skills at moving horses quietly through mountain terrain made them invaluable to Sloan's operation. They were paid well and promised bonuses based on the value of the animals they delivered. Among them was a local man named Dale Tackett, who had done occasional work for the Adkins family and who had access to the property, whose betrayal would prove essential to the operation's success and would seal his own fate. And that's when the nightmare began to unfold. You see, the night the thieves came was a night that had been chosen with care, a moonless October evening when darkness would cover their approach and the autumn wind would mask the sounds of their movement. The Adkins family had no reason to expect trouble on that particular night, no warning that the men who would destroy their world were already moving through the hollows toward the pastures where the 4 stallions grazed. The air was cold, carrying the first bite of the coming winter, and the mountains were black against a sky without stars. The hollow lay in absolute darkness, the kind of darkness that only mountain people truly understand, the kind that swallows sound and direction and leaves even familiar terrain feeling foreign and threatening. The thieves came in 3 groups, coordinated by Sloan himself, from a position on the ridge above the Adkins property. The first group targeted the pasture where Solomon and Ezekiel were kept, approaching from the west through a drainage that provided cover from the main house. The second group came from the east, moving toward the barn where Prophet was stabled for the night due to a minor leg injury that required monitoring. The third group positioned itself between the property and the road, ready to guide the stolen horses to the trailers that waited 3 miles away. The operation was professional in its execution. The thieves had studied the property for weeks, had mapped every fence line and gate, had identified the positions of the family members and the dogs that patrolled the grounds. They used sedatives to quiet the animals, substances administered through treated grain that Tackett had placed in the feeders hours earlier, his access to the property making the betrayal seamless. The stallions were docile by the time the thieves reached them, their magnificent spirits temporarily subdued by chemicals that would wear off long before they reached their destination. Solomon and Ezekiel were led from their pasture without incident, their hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of their movement across the rocky ground. Prophet was taken from the barn with equal efficiency, the thieves moving with a coordination that reflected careful planning and extensive experience. The entire operation, from approach to departure, took less than 40 minutes. But something went wrong with the 4th stallion. Patriarch, the oldest and wisest of the 4, had not eaten the treated grain. Whether from instinct or simple preference, the gray stallion had avoided the feed that would have rendered him compliant, and when the thieves entered his pasture, he responded with the intelligence and spirit that had made him Elijah's favorite. Patriarch fought. The 15-year-old stallion, sensing danger in the unfamiliar hands and unfamiliar scents, reared and struck and screamed with a fury that shattered the night's silence. His hooves connected with one of the thieves, breaking the man's arm and cracking 3 of his ribs, the stallion's power demonstrating why even experienced horsemen approached him with respect. His screams carried across the hollow, with a clarity that could not be mistaken for anything other than distress, the voice of an animal who knew that enemies had come to his home. The noise woke Elijah, who had been sleeping in the cabin 200 yards away. The old horseman recognized the sound instantly, knew before he was fully conscious that something was terribly wrong, was out of bed and reaching for his boots in a single motion that reflected decades of responding to sounds from the barn in the middle of the night. By the time Elijah reached the pasture, his sons, running behind him from their own cabins, scattered across the property. Patriarch was down. The thieves, panicked by the stallion's resistance and the noise it had generated, had used a captive bolt gun to subdue him, a device designed for slaughterhouse use that delivered a devastating blow to the animal's skull. Patriarch lay on the ground, his magnificent grey body motionless in the darkness, his great heart still beating, but his spirit already departing through the wound that the bolt had torn in his head. Elijah dropped to his knees beside his horse, gathered the great grey head in his arms, felt the warmth of the blood that soaked through his nightclothes, the blood of an animal he had raised from a wobbly-legged foal and loved for 15 years. The stallion's eyes were open, but unseeing, the intelligence that had animated them already fading, the life that had been the product of 6 generations of careful breeding, draining away into the cold October earth. Patriarch died in Elijah's arms as the old man wept. The horse's final breath, a soft exhalation that carried with it the end of everything the animal had represented. The great grey body shuddered once and then was still, the warmth beginning to leave muscles that had carried riders through mountains and sired foals that carried his excellence into the future. The thieves were gone by then, fled into the darkness with Solomon and Ezekiel and Prophet, leaving behind only the body of Patriarch and the devastation of a family whose world had been destroyed in a single night. Thomas was the first to reach his father, found Elijah kneeling in the pasture with Patriarch's head in his lap, his nightshirt soaked with the stallion's blood, his face showing a grief so raw and absolute that it would have broken the heart of anyone who witnessed it. The other brothers arrived moments later, each one taking in the scene with an understanding that did not require words. The empty pastures, the open gates, the dead stallion, the devastated Patriarch. In the space of 40 minutes, everything the Adkins family had spent nearly 2 centuries building had been stolen or destroyed. The days that followed were the darkest the Adkins family had ever known. The loss of the 4 stallions, 3 stolen and 1 killed, represented not merely financial devastation, but the destruction of a legacy that had taken 6 generations to build. The specific combination of bloodlines that those stallions carried, the accumulated genetic wisdom of nearly 2 centuries of careful breeding, was gone. Even if the stolen stallions were recovered, the damage to the program was incalculable, and Patriarch, the anchor of it all, was dead. Della handled the grief differently from her husband, channeling her sorrow into the practical work of maintaining the remaining herd, while Elijah was consumed by his loss. She was the one who fed the broodmares and the young stock, who kept the daily rhythms of the farm going, who held the family together through the raw force of her will, while her husband knelt each morning beside Patriarch's grave and stared at nothing. Elijah reported the theft to local authorities, who proved as useful as the family had expected, which was not useful at all. The sheriff's office took the report, filed it, and did nothing further. The sheriff himself was rumored to have financial connections to Sloan's operation, though nothing was ever proven. The state police were contacted and showed slightly more interest, but the investigation quickly stalled against the wall of silence that protected the thieves' network. Sloan's connections to wealthy and powerful interests made him effectively untouchable, his legitimate business providing cover for operations that the authorities were either unwilling or unable to penetrate. The Adkins family's attempts to pursue the matter through legal channels produced nothing but frustration and expense. Lawyers were consulted and found to be expensive and ineffective. Politicians were contacted and proved to be sympathetic but useless. Insurance claims were filed and denied on technicalities that seemed designed to protect the industry rather than the policyholder. The system that should have protected the family's property and punished the thieves instead protected the thieves and punished the family, which was required to pay legal fees and taxes on land that no longer supported the operation that had sustained it for generations. But the Adkins family had not survived 6 generations in the Kentucky mountains by relying on systems that served the interests of the powerful. They had their own traditions of justice, their own methods of settling debts, their own understanding of what was required when the law failed and the system protected the guilty. The family council that gathered 3 weeks after the theft included all 5 of Elijah's children, their spouses, and a selection of cousins and nephews whose loyalty to the family was absolute. They met in the kitchen of the main cabin, the same room where Adkins families had gathered for 6 generations to make the decisions that shaped their lives and their program. The fire burned low in the grate. The chairs were hard and straight-backed. No coffee was served, no pleasantries exchanged. Elijah sat at the head of the table, his face showing the grief that had aged him 10 years in 3 weeks, his eyes carrying a hardness that his children recognized as the look of a man who had made a decision and would not be swayed from it. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of authority that 6 generations of mountain patriarchy had invested in his position. They would find the men who had stolen their horses, who had killed Patriarch, who had destroyed a legacy that the Adkins family had spent nearly 2 centuries building. They would recover what could be recovered and avenge what could not. Every man who had participated in the theft would be held accountable, would pay a price that would be remembered throughout the Kentucky mountains for generations. And that decision, reached unanimously around a kitchen table by firelight, would set in motion a campaign of vengeance that would claim 19 lives and reshape the understanding of justice throughout the region. The planning process took 6 weeks, during which the family appeared to be doing nothing more than grieving their losses and trying to maintain what remained of their operation. The appearance was not entirely false, the grief was genuine, and the damage to the program was devastating. But beneath the surface of resignation, the Adkins family was preparing for something that the men who had stolen their horses could not have anticipated. Thomas, the eldest son, took the lead in identifying the thieves and mapping their operations. His knowledge of the horse world provided connections that law enforcement did not possess. Networks of horsemen and traders who saw things and heard things and shared information with people they trusted. The mountain horse community was tight-knit and loyal, and when word spread that the Adkins stallions had been stolen, information began flowing toward the family from sources that no investigator could have accessed. Within weeks, Thomas had identified Sloan as the organizer of the theft and had compiled a list of the 19 men who had participated in the actual operation. The intelligence was detailed and specific: names, addresses, habits, vulnerabilities, the locations where they ate and drank and slept and kept their own horses. The Adkins family approached the investigation with the same patience and thoroughness they applied to their breeding program, understanding that preparation was the foundation of success, and that haste would produce only failure. Samuel, the second son, handled logistics, mapping routes and timing, and ensuring that the family's movements could not be traced. William contributed his knowledge of the mountain terrain, identifying locations where actions could be taken without witnesses. James, the youngest son, monitored the movements of the targets, maintaining surveillance with a patience that reflected his hunting background. Mary, the daughter, provided intelligence from her own network of contacts among the horse families of the region, women who knew things and shared them through channels that men never thought to monitor. The method they chose reflected both the crime being avenged and the Adkins tradition of horsemanship. Each thief would be found and killed, his death connected to horses in a manner that left no doubt about why he was dying. The specific methods would vary, but the message would be consistent. The men who had stolen the Adkins stallions and killed Patriarch would pay with their lives in ways that honored the animals they had wronged. The first killing came 6 weeks after the family council. The target was Dale Tackett, the local collaborator who had placed the sedated grain in the feeders, the man who had been trusted by the family and who had betrayed that trust for Sloan's money. Tackett was found dead in his own barn, trampled by what appeared to be a horse, his body bearing the hoof-shaped bruises and fractures that were consistent with being kicked and stomped by a large animal. His ribs were shattered, his skull fractured, his internal organs ruptured by impacts that the medical examiner attributed to equine hooves. No horse was found at the scene, and the investigation concluded that Tackett had been killed by one of his own animals in a farming accident. The killing of Dale Tackett was the opening statement in a campaign that would ultimately claim 19 lives, each death connected to horses in a way that created a pattern visible only to those who understood what was happening. The Adkins family had declared war, and the first casualty was the traitor who had made the theft possible. The second killing came 2 weeks later. targeting one of the thieves who had led Solomon from the pasture. This man, named Robert Lawson, was found dead on a mountain road, his body showing injuries consistent with being dragged behind a horse at high speed. His clothes were shredded, his skin abraded to the bone in places, the gravel and rock of the mountain road having torn through fabric and flesh and muscle with an efficiency that left the body nearly unrecognizable. His death was ruled accidental, his foot assumed to have caught in a stirrup during a fall that turned catastrophic. The third and fourth killings came in quick succession, each victim dying in circumstances connected to horses. The third man was found in a field, his neck broken in a manner consistent with being thrown from a horse at full gallop, the trajectory of his body indicating that he had been launched from the saddle with tremendous force and had landed on his head. The fourth was discovered in a creek bed, his skull fractured by what appeared to be a kick from an unshod hoof, a single devastating blow that had caved in the temporal bone and ended his life before he could react. That's right. The Adkins family continued their campaign through the winter and into spring, striking with a regularity that reflected both their determination and their patience. The fifth man died as the first snow fell, found in a pasture with injuries that suggested he had been cornered by a stallion and kicked to death, his body bearing dozens of hoof marks that painted a picture of a man trapped and battered by an enraged animal. The sixth was discovered shortly after, his body trapped beneath a fallen horse in circumstances that appeared to be a riding accident gone catastrophically wrong, the weight of the animal having crushed his chest and suffocated him. The seventh and eighth killings came before Christmas, each victim dying in horse-related circumstances that raised no suspicions beyond the general observation that working with horses was a dangerous occupation. The seventh had apparently been kicked in the chest while attempting to shoe a horse, the impact stopping his heart. The eighth appeared to have been bitten and then trampled, his body showing the distinctive marks of equine teeth on his arms and shoulders, along with the hoof impacts that had actually killed him. The family varied their methods with each killing, drawing on their deep knowledge of horses and horse-related injuries to create death scenes that appeared tragically natural. Their understanding of how horses moved and kicked and bit, knowledge accumulated over 6 generations of breeding and training, allowed them to replicate equine violence with a precision that fooled every investigator who examined the scenes. The 9th death came in January 1980, the 10th shortly after. By this point, half of the 19 men who had participated in the theft were dead, but the deaths were so widely separated in time and location and apparent cause that no one had connected them into a pattern. Some had appeared to be trampling deaths, others riding accidents, others the result of kicks or bites. Each death was investigated by local authorities who had no reason to look beyond the obvious explanation that working with large animals carried inherent risks. The family's knowledge of horses, accumulated over 6 generations, made them uniquely qualified for this particular form of vengeance. They understood how horses moved, how they kicked, how they reacted to threats and stimuli, how they could be used as weapons by people who understood their behavior at the deepest level. They could predict with remarkable accuracy what a horse would do in a given situation, could replicate the results of equine violence using methods that left no traces inconsistent with the apparent cause of death. Some victims were attacked by horses that the Adkins family had trained for the purpose, animals whose natural power was directed against specific targets through behavioral cues that only expert horsemen would know how to give. Others were placed in situations where horse-related death was the inevitable outcome, lured or forced into circumstances where the terrain and the animals combined to produce results that appeared accidental. The psychological impact on the surviving thieves began to manifest as the deaths continued. Some dismissed the fatalities as coincidence, the inevitable result of men who worked with horses facing the risks inherent in their profession. Others began to sense a pattern, began to count the dead, and wonder whether so many horse-related deaths among men connected to a single operation could truly be explained by chance. Sloan himself was among those who recognized the pattern first. As a horseman, he understood that the rate at which his men were dying in horse-related circumstances exceeded anything that coincidence could explain. He began to take precautions, warned his surviving associates to stay away from horses entirely, tried to distance himself from the theft that had set the campaign in motion. But his warnings came too late for most, and for those who heeded them, the Adkins family simply adapted their methods. The 11th killing came in February, targeting a man who had heeded Sloane's warning and avoided horses entirely. This man was found dead in his home, his skull bearing a wound consistent with a horse kick, though no horse was present in the vicinity. The medical examiner concluded that he had been attacked by a loose animal that had subsequently fled, a conclusion that satisfied the authorities, but that Sloane recognized as deeply troubling. The message was clear: avoiding horses would not save anyone. The 12th and 13th killings followed in quick succession, each death bearing the hallmarks of horse-related violence, despite occurring in locations and circumstances that strained credibility. The 14th came in spring, the 15th shortly after. The surviving thieves were now openly terrified, some fleeing the state entirely, others turning to alcohol or religion in desperate attempts to escape what they had come to believe was a supernatural curse visited upon them by the horses they had stolen. The superstitious fear that gripped the surviving men worked to the Adkins family's advantage. Men who believed they were cursed made mistakes that rational men would not have made, abandoned precautions that might have protected them, sought comfort in places where they were vulnerable. Their psychological collapse made the family's work easier, though no easier to bear. Each killing extracted a cost from the Adkins family as well, a weight that accumulated with each death even as the debt to Patriarch and the stolen stallions was slowly repaid. During this time, the family also made efforts to recover the stolen stallions. Thomas's network of contacts eventually located Solomon and Prophet at a breeding facility in Virginia, where they had been held under false registration papers that disguised their origins. The recovery operation was conducted quietly. The stallions returned to the Adkins property in the middle of the night by Thomas and Samuel, who drove through darkness for 12 hours to bring their horses home. The moment when Solomon and Prophet walked down the trailer ramp and onto Adkins soil was one that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. The stallions seemed to recognize their home immediately, their ears pricking forward, their nostrils flaring as they took in the familiar scents of the pastures where they had been born. Solomon nickered softly, the sound carrying across the hollow like a greeting to the land itself. Ezekiel was found at a facility in Tennessee, similarly disguised under false papers, and was recovered shortly after through similar means. The 3 surviving stallions were reunited on the Adkins property, their return celebrated by a family that had feared they would never see them again. But the recovery of the horses did not end the campaign. Patriarch was still dead, the legacy had still been violated, and the men responsible had still not all paid the price that the family had determined they owed. The 16th death came in summer, 1 year after the theft, the anniversary timing deliberate, though no one but the family understood its significance. The 17th and 18th killings followed as autumn approached, each death bringing the total closer to the 19 that the family had sworn to reach. Each victim died in circumstances connected to horses, the consistency of the method maintaining the message, even as investigators in multiple jurisdictions continued to treat each death as an isolated accident. The 19th and final target was Vernon Sloane himself, the man who had organized the theft, who had hired the men who carried it out, who had ordered the use of the captive bolt that killed Patriarch when the grey stallion refused to submit. Sloane had taken extreme precautions by this point, had surrounded himself with security, had avoided horses entirely, had essentially imprisoned himself in his Lexington office, where he believed no horse-related death could reach him. He was wrong. The Adkins family reached Sloane on the anniversary of Patriarch's death, exactly 1 year after the grey stallion had been struck down in his own pasture. The details of how they accomplished what they accomplished in a Lexington office building would be debated for years afterward. What is known is that Sloane was found dead at his desk, his skull bearing a wound that the medical examiner identified as consistent with a horse kick, a circular fracture pattern that matched the shape of a horseshoe with the precision of a forensic demonstration. How that wound came to be inflicted in a third-floor Lexington office, how the Adkins family breached the building's security, how they delivered the blow that killed Sloane with such precision that it replicated equine violence perfectly. These questions were never answered. The investigation produced no evidence. The building's security had noticed nothing unusual, and the case was eventually filed as unsolved. Some investigators speculated that the wound had been inflicted by a device designed to replicate a horse kick rather than by an actual animal. Others believed the Adkins family had somehow managed the impossible, had brought a horse into the building in an act of vengeance that was as symbolic as it was deadly. The truth, like so much else about the Adkins campaign, remained a secret held by the family and the mountains that sheltered them. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the killing stopped. The Adkins family was never arrested, never tried, never officially connected to the deaths that had eliminated Vernon Sloan and 18 of his associates over the course of a year. The evidence that might have convicted them was never found. The deaths were all attributed to horse-related accidents or unsolved circumstances, and the community that had supported them maintained its silence even after the campaign ended. The mountain people understood what had happened and approved of it, and their silence was as impenetrable as the mountains themselves. But everyone knew, the horse people knew, the law enforcement community suspected. The families of the dead men sensed the truth even if they could not prove it. They understood what had happened and why, understood that 19 men had paid with their lives for the crime of stealing 4 stallions and killing a 5th, understood that the Adkins family had extracted a justice that the official system would never have provided. The family lived for decades after the killings ended, remaining on the Pike County land their ancestors had claimed nearly 2 centuries earlier. The breeding program was rebuilt, slowly and painfully, around the 3 recovered stallions and the broodmares who had remained on the property throughout the ordeal. Solomon and Ezekiel and Prophet resumed their roles as the foundation of the program, their foals carrying forward the bloodlines that 6 generations of Adkins had cultivated with devotion that transcended ordinary labor. Elijah lived to see the program restored to something approaching its former glory, though he always maintained that the loss of Patriarch had created a gap that could never be truly filled. The Grey Stallion's bloodline continued through his existing offspring, but the specific qualities that had made him unique, the combination of wisdom and steadiness and beauty that had been the product of 15 years of careful development, could not be exactly reproduced. Something had been lost with Patriarch that no amount of breeding could recover, a particular expression of equine excellence that had existed in one animal and would never exist in precisely the same form again. Elijah died in the spring of 1991 at the age of 76, found one morning in the pasture where Patriarch had been killed, sitting against the fence post where the stallion had fallen, apparently having passed peacefully in the night while visiting the spot where his favorite horse had died 12 years earlier. He was buried on the ridge above the property, beside the grave of Patriarch himself, the horseman, and the horse reunited in the soil of the mountain they had both loved. Della survived her husband by 8 years, dying in 1999 at the age of 81, the last of the generation that had overseen the crisis and the response. She was buried beside Elijah, the couple together on the ridge that overlooked the pastures where their horses still grazed, the land they had dedicated their lives to maintaining. Her contribution to the campaign was acknowledged only in whispers, but those who knew the family understood that Della's intelligence and organizational ability had been as essential to its success as her husband's determination. The children continued the program after their parents' deaths, each generation adding its own chapter to a story that had begun with Josiah Adkins and a pair of horses crossing the mountains from Virginia. Thomas ran the operation until his own retirement, then passed it to his eldest son, who runs it still. The Adkins name remains synonymous with the finest mountain horses in eastern Kentucky, the reputation that nearly 2 centuries of work had built, surviving the crisis of 1979, through the determination of a family that refused to let their legacy die. The aftermath of the Adkins campaign reshaped the horse trading world in eastern Kentucky for a generation. The exposure of Sloan's operation, which came through investigation and journalism in the years that followed, revealed a network of horse theft that had been operating throughout the region for decades. The syndicate had stolen hundreds of horses from families who lacked the resources or the will to fight back, had laundered the animals through a series of false registrations and fraudulent sales, had built a fortune on the stolen heritage of mountain horse families. The investigations that followed Sloane's death dismantled what remained of his organization. Associates who had not been among the 19 killed provided information in exchange for leniency, revealing the scope of an operation that was far larger than anyone had suspected. Dozens of stolen horses were recovered and returned to their rightful owners, families who had lost animals years earlier and had given up hope of ever seeing them again. The reforms that followed were significant. Horse registration systems were strengthened, requiring DNA verification that made it far more difficult to disguise stolen animals. Law enforcement agencies established specialized units to investigate horse theft, recognizing that the crime had been treated too casually by authorities who did not understand the cultural and economic significance of horses in mountain communities. Training programs were developed to help officers understand the value of breeding programs and the devastation that theft could cause to families whose entire heritage was invested in their animals. The cultural impact extended beyond policy changes. The Adkins story became a legend throughout the Kentucky horse world and beyond, a reminder of what could happen when those who stole horses underestimated the families who bred them. Horsemen told each other the story as a warning about the consequences of theft, as a reminder that mountain horse families possessed resources and determination that outsiders could not comprehend. The gravesite where Elijah and Della rest together, beside the grave of Patriarch, became a place of pilgrimage for horsemen who knew the story. People traveled from across the state and beyond to pay respects, to stand in the pasture where the gray stallion had fallen, to see the descendants of Solomon and Ezekiel and Prophet grazing on the same land their ancestors had grazed for nearly 2 centuries. The songs that emerged from the Adkins story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, from the theft through the campaign to the final killing. These songs celebrated the family's determination, described their revenge in terms that bordered on admiration, portrayed them as guardians of a heritage that no amount of money could replace. The first songs appeared within months of the campaign's conclusion, composed by local musicians who understood the power of the narrative and the particular resonance it held for horse communities. These early ballads spread through the Kentucky mountains and beyond, carried by the same oral tradition that had preserved the stories of earlier mountain conflicts. The songs served multiple purposes, functioning simultaneously as entertainment, moral instruction, and historical preservation of events that the official record treated only as a series of unrelated accidents. One popular ballad described the night of the theft, painting a vivid picture of dark figures moving through moonless hollows, of magnificent stallions led away from the pastures they had known all their lives, of Patriarch's final stand against the men who would take him. The song captured the horror of the captive bolt, the sound of the device striking the gray stallion's skull, the image of Elijah kneeling beside his dying horse in the darkness, the old man's nightshirt soaked with blood. The melody was haunting and built on traditional Kentucky patterns, a minor key that captured both the sorrow of loss and the fury of response. Musicians reported that audiences of horsemen would sit in complete silence during certain verses, that men who worked with horses every day would weep openly at the description of Patriarch's death, that the song created an emotional response so powerful that some listeners could not hear it through to the end. Another song told the story of the campaign itself, describing the horse-related deaths in ways that celebrated the poetic justice of the methods. This song had an almost darkly humorous quality, each verse describing a thief meeting his end through the very animals he had stolen or intended to steal, the horses themselves becoming instruments of vengeance in ways that seemed almost supernatural. The final verse, describing Sloane's death in his Lexington office from a wound that could only have been made by a horse, was sung with a kind of wondering disbelief that matched the reaction of investigators who had examined the scene. A third song focused on the breeding program itself, celebrating the 6 generations of knowledge and dedication that the theft had threatened to destroy. This song was different from the others in that it portrayed the horses themselves as characters, as living links to a history that stretched back to the founding of the nation, as irreplaceable treasures whose value could not be measured in the currency of markets, but only in the currency of love and knowledge and time. Historians who have studied the Adkins case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of property rights defense in a region where the legal system consistently failed to protect the holdings of rural families. They note that the theft of the Adkins stallions was possible because law enforcement treated horse theft as a minor property crime, failing to understand that the cultural and genetic value of breeding stock far exceeded any dollar amount. Others have focused on the cultural significance of horses in Appalachian communities, examining how the theft of breeding stock represented an assault on heritage that transcended ordinary property crime. The Adkins stallions were not merely valuable animals, but the genetic repositories of 6 generations of accumulated knowledge, living links to ancestors who had dedicated their lives to building something that money could not replace. The economic analysis has examined the devastating ripple effects of the theft beyond the Adkins family itself. Dozens of breeders throughout the region depended on access to the Adkins stallions for their own programs, and the loss of those animals disrupted breeding plans and reduced the quality of foal crops across a wide area. The economic damage extended far beyond the value of the individual horses, affecting an entire regional economy that was built on the foundation of quality breeding stock. Psychologists have examined the family dynamics that made the campaign possible, noting how 6 generations of shared purpose and intense family loyalty created a unit capable of sustained, coordinated action that would have been impossible for most families. The Adkins operated as a team in ways that echoed their collaboration in the breeding program, each member playing a specific role, each contribution essential to the success of the whole. The forensic analysis has generated particular fascination among experts. The deaths attributed to the Adkins campaign were remarkably consistent in their apparent cause, each victim appearing to have been killed by horse-related violence, yet occurring in circumstances that pushed the boundaries of plausibility. The final killing, with its wound consistent with a horse kick inflicted in a Lexington office building, has been analyzed by forensic experts who remain divided on whether the wound was inflicted by an actual horse or by a device designed to replicate equine violence with extraordinary precision. You see, what the Adkins family did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. They killed 19 men, each death connected to horses in ways that sent an unmistakable message about why the victim was dying. The fact that their victims had participated in the theft of 4 stallions and the killing of a 5th does not eliminate the fact that they took 19 human lives in response to the loss of animals that, however valued, were not human. And yet their story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. The Adkins family lost something that 6 generations had built, something that represented their identity and their heritage and their purpose. Patriarch was killed before Elijah's eyes, his skull shattered by a device designed for slaughterhouses. 3 magnificent stallions were stolen from the pastures they had known since birth, drugged and led away by men who saw in them nothing but dollar signs and profit margins. Their story challenges us to consider what we mean by property and its defense, by heritage and its protection, by the bonds between humans and the animals they breed and raise and love. The legal system viewed the stolen horses as property, assignable a dollar value, subject to insurance claims and civil litigation. The Adkins family viewed them as something far more, as living embodiments of 6 generations of knowledge and care, as irreplaceable links to ancestors who had crossed the mountains with a dream of what Kentucky horses could become. The question of proportionality haunts the story as it haunts all such narratives. 4 horses stolen, 1 killed, 19 men dead. Was the response proportionate? The answer depends entirely on how one values the horses. If they were merely property, the response was wildly disproportionate, an insane overreaction to what amounted to livestock theft. If they were what the Adkins family believed them to be, living heritage that could never be replaced, the genetic culmination of nearly 2 centuries of devotion, then the question becomes far more complex, far more difficult to dismiss. The descendants of the Adkins family still breed horses on that same Pike County land, still carry the knowledge that Josiah Adkins brought across the mountains nearly 2.5 centuries ago. The bloodlines of Solomon and Ezekiel and Prophet continue to produce horses of extraordinary quality. animals that carry in their blood the accumulated wisdom of 8 generations of careful selection. Patriarch's line continues through his offspring, the Grey Stallion's legacy, preserved through animals that remind the family daily of what they lost and what they defended. The hills of Pike County remain today, much as they were in Elijah's time, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The pastures where the stallions graze are green in spring and golden in autumn. The land as beautiful and productive as it was when Josiah first saw it and recognized its potential. The modern world has encroached somewhat, but the essential character of the place remains unchanged. The mountains still sheltering families whose connection to their animals defines who they are and what they will do to protect them. The story of the Adkins family endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of love between humans and horses, of the bonds that form across species when generations of care and attention create something that transcends ordinary partnership. It is the story of heritage and its defense, of what people will do to protect something that represents their family's greatest achievement. It is the story of vengeance and its costs, of the terrible things that loss can drive good people to do when the systems that should protect them fail. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Elijah stood, to see the graves where he and Della rest beside Patriarch, to walk the pastures where the descendants of those legendary stallions still graze? Would you breathe the mountain air, feel the wind that has blown through these ridges for millennia, sense the presence of history that lingers in certain places? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the cemetery is difficult to find without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The drive from Lexington takes most of a day, winding through horse country that transitions from the manicured bluegrass farms of central Kentucky to the rugged mountain pastures of the east. The contrast is striking. The difference between the world of wealthy owners who view horses as investments and the world of mountain families who view them as family. The paved roads give way to gravel, and the gravel gives way to dirt tracks that require careful navigation. The people who live in the surrounding hollows still know the Adkins story, still speak of Elijah and Patriarch when strangers ask about the history of the region. They will point the way to the cemetery, will share their own memories or the memories their parents passed down, will help visitors understand the context that makes the story comprehensible. They do not judge the Adkins family for what they did, do not condemn them as murderers. See in their actions the response of horse people who had been robbed of something that could never be replaced, and who chose to respond in the only way the mountains had taught them. The cemetery sits on a ridge above the property, sheltered by trees that have grown tall in the decades since Elijah was buried there. 3 markers stand together, Elijah and Della side by side, and between them a stone that marks the grave of Patriarch, the grey stallion buried with the same dignity and love that a human family member would have received. The horseman and his horse rest side by side as they stood side by side in life, their partnership continuing in the soil of the mountain they both loved. Standing at those graves, looking out over the pastures where horses still graze, one can almost feel the presence of those who rest there. They are gone, of course, have been gone for years now, but what passed between them remains, preserved in memory and song and story, in the blood of horses that still carry the genetics of animals, bred by 6 generations of mountain horsemen. The questions they force us to ask, about love and its objects, about heritage and its defense, about justice and its sources, have no easy answers. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of the Adkins family close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. Their story will continue to be told as long as people breed horses and love them, and understand that some things cannot be measured in money, cannot be replaced by insurance payments, cannot be reduced to entries in a ledger. They are gone now, horseman and horse, dust mingling with the earth of the ridge where they lived and worked and where they rest. But what happened between them echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Adkins family, who slaughtered 19 men after they stole 4 prize stallions and killed a 5th on the family property in Pike County, Kentucky. Each thief killed in circumstances connected to horses, each death a message about the consequences of stealing a mountain family's heritage, the campaign continuing for 1 year until every man responsible had paid with his life. A story of love between humans and horses, of devastating loss and patient fury, of justice found where the law would not provide it, and of a family who proved that 6 generations of horsemen will not surrender their legacy without a fight that the thieves could never have imagined. The mountains remember, and through them so do we all.